This is Gregory Burnt with St. Leo University, and I'm doing a presentation on Mexican and Central American children of immigrants in the child welfare system. Over the past several decades, there has been an influx of immigrants from south of the American border. Individuals and families primarily from Mexico, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras have come to America in pursuit of a happier, safer, and more economically stable life. Many have fled extreme poverty and gang violence in their own countries. Due to their exigent circumstances and the lengthy process involved in obtaining legal citizenship, the majority of immigrants who survive the dangerous journey enter the country illegally. They are faced with a plethora of challenges, the scary of which is the constant threat of deportation. Approximately 1/4 of American children have at least one parent who is an immigrant. 500,000 children experience the apprehension, detention, or deportation of at least one of their parents over a 2-year period. Young children of immigrant parents are twice as likely to need mental health services as those of native-born parents. Nearly 2/3 of adolescents with immigrant parents show a clinical need for mental health services. And when a family is shattered and a parent is deported, there are a number of short-term consequences. There's a financial strain on the family. If the father is deported and it's usually the mother holding up the household, she may have to get a second job and work longer hours and be less available to her family. There's a loss of stability in the household. Without one of the parents being there, it creates a chaotic atmosphere and changes what a normal day looks like. It can make it very difficult on children. Whether they're placed in foster care or there's one parent, there's oftentimes an increased likelihood for absence from school. There's a difficulty fitting in socially, which is already difficult having come from an immigrant background. There's struggles with verbal communication, especially if English is a second language. There are also physiological issues, nightmares, lack of sleep, headaches and indigestion, not eating. Many of these children demonstrate anger and aggression because they're so upset about their situation, having their parents removed from their country and being here on their own. There's an exorbitant amount of stress on these children without their parents there. And then when the parents are sent back to their own country, there's a lot of difficulty sometimes for the child to contact the parent. They don't know how to reach out to them. Their parent could be being detained somewhere or might have an address they can't reach or a phone number that they don't have. And even when it's just one parent removed, there's an increased likelihood of child welfare services being involved with the remaining parent due to all the strife and tribulations that are put on that remaining parent to keep up a household. The long-term consequences are innumerable, but here are several. The effects of toxic stress and trauma are proven to have lifelong effects on children. They have adverse impact on cognitive, socio-emotional, and behavioral development. When children are this age and something this harrowing happens to them, it really has a lasting impact. So, just on how their brain works, how they develop, how they interact with other people, how they can function in the world. And it doesn't just stop with their life. There's something called intergenerational trauma, which means they're likely to pass it on to their own children. Just like they may have gotten it from their own parents due to stress and trauma that they experienced in their home country. They may develop unhealthy coping mechanisms and suppression, so a lot of times they'll just keep this to themselves. They don't speak the language here, they don't feel like they have anybody to talk to about it, they'll just kind of sweep it under the rug, which is a really unhealthy way of dealing with trauma and toxic stress. And later in life, they have an increased susceptibility to alcohol, drug addiction, and other maladaptive behaviors. The following will be a video about specifically migrant children, but ultimately just the effects of trauma when a child is separated from their parent and what it has on a kid.
When a young child suddenly loses their parents, it's basically seen as a death. It's the absolute worst trauma that a child could have. Okay, this is something that is known. This is something that has been talked about. So nobody should be taking this by surprise. Now, even with small periods of absence, you can have potentially permanent changes. But longer periods of absence, longer periods of trauma, longer periods of neglect are going to most likely have permanent signs and symptomatology for these kids. These kids potentially are going to be damaged for the rest of their lives.
Extraño mucho a mi mamá.
Some kids get angry, some kids start to scream and cry, some become despondent and hopeless. Some, again, struggle with sleep, some stop eating or eat much less. Their ability to interact with other people becomes worse. It becomes much more troubling for them in a variety of contexts. With many of these kids, they might develop a fear of leaving their parents, school refusals, anxiety disorders, more long-standing post-traumatic symptoms, a fear of interacting with strangers, but most notably, a fear of impending doom of what's going to happen to their parents next. We all know that these kids have come from struggling environments, some more traumatic than others, but likely all of them traumatic and difficult. They get here, they're hungry, many were sick, some have died. These kids are at huge risk. They do not have the defensive structure that an average child would have. So the impact on removing their parents and then God knows what happening to them is going to be far more significant than, say, an average child. It's extremely important that there be an intensive assessment of these kids sooner rather than later. There needs to be a lot more put forth in regards to trying to help these kids to get them reunited with their families, to get them the treatment that they need. And most importantly, they need to get back to a normalized life. The impression that I've gotten with many of these kids is that this has not happened yet.
There are a number of ethical dilemmas when children are separated from parents and when they are placed in foster homes and they come from immigrant families. There's a lack of accessibility to a lot of the resources that they need. They can't get the mental health services. They can't get the government assistance. They can't get the parenting classes. The families are kind of on their own. Additionally, even when families are referred to these services, a lot of the times they get there and then they are told that they're not eligible or that they do not qualify for the services that they need. Child welfare services workers don't understand immigration issues sometimes, and this creates a situation where they make unrealistic case plans. So they tell an immigrant family, you need to do this, and this in order to follow through on the goals and meet the requirements that we have for you, but those aren't attainable or feasible for the parents because they don't understand all of the factors that go into being an immigrant in this country and what they're facing on a daily basis. Workers may not place a child with a relative when caretaker is deported. So if a parent gets set off, there might be an aunt or uncle in Texas that the child can live with, but they place them into a foster home because they're undocumented. They don't do their due diligence to see if there's a better situation for the child, and they just place them in foster care or in a foster home. The lack of supervisory role in foreign country may cause the agency to unnecessarily place child with foster parent instead of a family abroad. So even if their only best caretaker is back in Mexico or Honduras, because the child welfare services workers won't have the oversight, they will place them in a foster home here, even though they might have a better home with their parent back in their native country. And the truth is that regardless of the oversight, you can communicate with consulates and third parties there to make sure that you're still supervising the case from a distance. So it is possible. They just have to go through the legwork to get that done. There's a number of cultural, gender, and class issues. Sometimes there's different cultural parenting styles, and the expectations of the child welfare services workers are not the same. So it's not on us as American child welfare services workers to impose our parenting values. Sometimes we have to see that people do things differently in different cultures. This requires cultural competency. There are language barriers that we face in communicating, which needs to be addressed. Sometimes these families come from a country where the government involvement in private life is minimal, so they might not be used to have in El Salvador. They might just think that the government is its own entity and they don't interfere in our affairs. So that might be a new concept for them. Also, in many of these countries that they come from, there's a very corrupt government and they don't trust it. So they've been conditioned to not trust what the government's trying to sell them. And that might make them apprehensive about getting the services even if they're eligible. Some micro-level potential solutions include increased parental involvement in child's education, capitalizing on support where available. If they are eligible, make sure they're getting the services that are available to them. Prioritizing children's mental and physical well-being, and seeking out benefits in citizenship. Even though it's a grueling process, you can get the ball rolling and see if you're eligible for it. And also parenting classes. The meso level, there can be community outreach and community involvement. There's youth programs that kids can get involved in that can help with their assimilation and get used to the country and the culture while also preserving their own culture. English second language classes, the language barrier can be extremely detrimental when you're trying to prosper in this country. So teaching these children English as a second language so that they can be bilingual will give them increased opportunities later in life. And on the macro level, organizational structure. Put an emphasis on staffing people whose sole purpose is to service the children of immigrant families. For example, state offices create a liaison to work with agencies that deal with the population, offer resources, and answer questions. Training. Some states like Florida and New Jersey offer training for child welfare service employees to help them better understand the needs and concerns of their immigrant clients. The training focuses especially on cultural competency. This needs to be universal in all states. Language access. All CWS agencies have to have bilingual employees who can communicate with Spanish-speaking clients and help them receive the best services available for them and their children. Licensing. There are currently varying laws from state to state about required licensing for being a caregiver. There needs to be an emphasis on placing a child with family whenever possible. All states must reevaluate licensure policies to help unauthorized relatives be able to take in children and avoid having them put into foster care. Screening for immigration benefits. Agencies must employ special workers who screen children for immigration benefits such as naturalization, humanitarian protection, and relief from deportation. Confidentiality. Agencies must prioritize confidentiality and limit information sharing with federal programs like ICE. Protecting their clients' private information is of paramount importance. Breaching that trust puts children and their families at risk, and it makes it very difficult to engage with them. And here are my references. Thank you all for listening so much, and I hope that they address these concerns within the child welfare agencies and how to deal with children from immigrant families.